College in Syracuse, New York, where she teaches courses in women's history, civil rights, American history, and world civilization. She was an editor on the first volume of Frederick Douglass's correspondence, published by Yale University's Press in 2009, and the author of Southern Womanhood and Slavery, a biography of Louisa S. McCord, recently released in paperback, and Mystic, Connecticut, from Equat Village to Tourist Town. She is here today to speak about the most recent work, Women in the World of Frederick Douglass, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2017. Women in the World of Frederick Douglass has won the New York History Academy's Herbert Lehman Prize and the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic's Mary Kelly Prize, and was a finalist for the New York Public Library's Harriet Tubman Prize. It has also been released in paperback this spring. So I'm sure with the life lessons that Leigh has learned along the way, and she has many things to share that we're not familiar with. So, Leigh, thank you for coming today.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming on a Sunday when it's not raining. I don't know what the weather has been like to here, but I know it's about ready to build an ark. So we even went all the way, me and my husband went all the way to Italy, and it rained in Italy. So anyway, thank you very much for coming here and having me speak on one of my favorite subjects, Frederick Douglass. You may or may not know, he actually spoke here in Grafton. And you do? Yay, okay. And it was very early in his career. It was like, he was in April, the end of April in 1842, and he had just become an abolitionist, a professional abolitionist. I think he was born an abolitionist, and then he found out he was a slave, and he didn't want to be a slave. I think he kind of became an abolitionist, but he just become a professional abolitionist the previous, September. So here he was here in one of the places that he honed his skills to become the speaker that he became, and he was 24 years old. You know, so imagine that. I mean, he was a kid. I mean, when I was 24, I think I was a kid, but 24, he was a kid, and one of his traveling companions in those early days on 3 tours was Abby Kelly, who I don't have. She's a woman who needs no introduction around here, especially since she's sitting in the front row. And the two of them, when I started to research this book, and I got to that kind of, there were certain points that you think would be no-brainers to write about. It turned out that actually getting him into the abolitionist movement with women was, was obvious, but trying to tell a story, especially a personal story, was difficult. And then I get into, and I start realizing how often he's traveling with her, how they're there together, traveling together, and starting to think of how significant that was, because here he is with a white woman traveling, and they're both together on the stage. And so really right there at the beginning, it's women's rights, women, abolition, it's all together right there from the beginning. There's no learning about it, it's right there from the beginning. But I'm getting ahead of my story. Okay. So today I have 3 interrelated tasks. The first is to answer, who exactly were these women in the world of Frederick Douglass? The second is to explain the reason why they are so important that they have to have a whole book written about them, and probably could have several books written about them. And the third, to do it in such a way that you actually would want to run out and read the book and find out just how fascinating and important, and how they tell you so much more about what it was like to be a woman in the 19th century who wanted to do good in the world. And I would think that most of us in this room would understand that or can relate to that in some way or another. So let's begin with this proposition. Frederick Douglass would not have been Frederick Douglass, arguably the most important black man, if not the most important man, if not the most important person of the 19th century, if it were not for women. Women shaped his development, influenced his ideology, and enabled his success as an activist in a broadly defined war against racism, in which the personal was political, whether they wanted it to be or not.
Could you just try to speak out a little bit further, or could you come out? Maybe on the podium?
I need a script.
Podium doesn't move.
Okay, I need a script.
Okay. Podium's on wheels, though, isn't it?
Oh, it is?
No, it's hooked up to wires. I have to make sure the wires are long enough.
Wires, yeah.
Oh, even better. And then I'll move my,
Just a little difficult for some of the people in the back.
have a mic put on it?
No, not in this, yeah.
how's that? Oh God, I feel like, remember Melissa McCarthy's Sean Spicer? Okay. Okay, I'm trying to adjust. I'm recording myself live, partly for, purposes, but partly, because I'm kind of an egotist. But also, okay. Hi, Mom. Okay. And of course, nobody's watching me. So, so that's what's important. Okay, so, yes. Okay, and I'll try to use my Shakespeare voice. So, the women who I will discuss today. Okay, well, actually, on that point, I mean, can you imagine? Wardrobe malfunctions. Okay, on that, I mean, can you imagine in those days without the amplification that, I mean, he spoke to rooms, 300 people. She spoke to rooms. I mean, that what their voices, their lung capacity, their diaphragms must have been like. So, all right, so the women who I'll discuss today are not the only women in the book. They're certainly not the only women in his life, but they are some of the key figures who created the man whose bicentennial we celebrated last year, and who, well, I personally will keep celebrating on and on. Ironically, let's see if I get this right. Yeah. Ironically, the first woman in his life, his mother, Harriet Bailey, there is no image of her. He said that this image here of Ramses II reminded him of her. Well, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on with that. But and then that is an illustration from his third autobiography, Life and Times. He hated the illustrations. But when you're doing a talk and you want to represent her, this is what I bring. So, she's most notable for her absence in his life. He said, "My knowledge of my mother is very scanty, but very distinct. Yet I cannot say that I was very deeply attached to her, certainly not so deeply as I should have been had our relations in childhood been different." Now, of his grandmother, Betsy Bailey, who cared for him as a toddler, he said, "I infer that she especially was held in high esteem, far higher than is the lot of most colored persons in the slave states." She had very few memories of his mother, except this one, which is illustrated here, in which she defended him. But he had more that he could flesh out about his grandmother. And from what the records show, she was a midwife and a formidable matriarch of a very large family. She was still giving birth to children while her children, her older children, were giving birth to children. It's a very country family. Okay? And so he had uncles who were younger than him. Okay. But he only knew her for a few years, and any privilege that was accorded to him, like for instance, being sent to Baltimore, which was a very coveted assignment, probably came through the respect that was accorded to her, rather than any innate or observed, or rather in addition to, if it was by the cause of this, anything special about him. Okay. Now, when you read through his three autobiographies, his narrative, his My Bondage and My Freedom, and then Life and Times, which he expanded into editions. You get the sense of a man suffering from the pain of having been profoundly abused and abandoned. And that was the nature of childhood under slavery, to be abused. You also get the sense that as an adult, he struggled to empathize with the two women tasked with abandoning him. Because being forced to abandon him was abuse inflicted on them. They had this child who they loved and they cared about, one who gave birth to him, and now they're being told they have to abandon him. That's abuse to him. It's also abuse to them. Forces beyond children, mothers, fathers, grandmothers tore enslaved families apart before they could form as a family, and then blamed the victims of this for the results. And his adult awareness of this process made Douglass a man firmly committed to his own wife and children, both as an emotional bulwark, but also as a political act. A functional Black family, loving, supportive, intact, and protected from harm, something we would think is something normal or conservative even, was a radical act that his master had denied him. And the preservation of such a family and freedom became a significant part of his identity that I don't think many of his biographers have seriously considered, especially those who are bent on portraying him as adulterous. And more on this later, along with his partner in this venture, Anna Murray. Now, with his maternal affection severed, this little boy, Frederick, and again, we always think of the big guy, okay, the handsome man, the charismatic man. This little boy, Frederick, okay, took and even manipulated by his descriptions affection where he could. In hunger, he coaxed food from his first mistress, Lucretia Auld, by singing to her outside of her parlor window. She pitied me if she did not love me, he believed, and he took that because that's what was offered. Later, his de facto mistress, Sophia Auld, welcomed him almost as a foster child, much to his surprise. The crouching servility of a slave, he observed, was not understood nor desired by this gentle woman. She also answered his request to learn to read. Yet she soon turned on him, according to her husband's orders. She learned her own role as a slave mistress, and much research done into this will tell you that slave mistresses could be just as mean as their husbands. But the work had been done. The work had been done, and he had learned to read. She had poured in him on a path toward intellectual liberation that he followed, leading other slaves, freedmen, his own children, and even incorporating this into a broad civil rights agenda that went beyond just ending slavery, but elevating the mind, liberating the mind. Now, perhaps he should have learned to mistrust women, given that in his childhood they offered him life, affection, food, and education, only to snatch everything away, abandoning him somehow or another. But he did not. Although for a time he found comrades and intellectual challenge among the men in the fields of Talbot County or the shipyards in the free Black community of Baltimore, he also found that Black women in that community were comrades in their own ways. Indeed, for most of his life, he seemed comfortable and relaxed, more comfortable and relaxed in the company of women. Now, this is probably because the doctrine of separate spheres and the belief that inherent differences in men and women kept them apart, something that even women's rights activists bought into. And that was just the way they thought about the world at the time. And Douglass often found himself in competition with other men. After all, there can only be one alpha male, one leader of the race. And so they're always kind of sparring for that role. But women were more collaborative. Okay? And they collaborated with him. And they largely worked in tandem with him. Okay? So they saw themselves as complementary. Okay? They weren't trying to be the alpha female in competition with him being the alpha male. And that, of course, does not mean that they kept in the background. Okay? And here are some of the women that he worked with. Not all of them. Okay? This is in the abolitionist movement and the activist movement. Okay. In 1838, of course, Douglass ran away from slavery and moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts with his wife, Anna Murray. That alone was very much a collaborative effort. I mean, the stories are that she sewed the sailor uniform he wore. She financed this pretty much. And then, of course, the two of them are running away to have a free life together. I mean, she took a risk too. And she severed her ties too. And they went to form this life together. In fact, he describes it. I shouldered one part of my baggage, Anna shouldered the other, and we set off with our life together forthwith. Then he became a lecturer for the American Anti-Slavery Society in late 1841. Now, these were the Garrisonians, and I don't want to get all into the, like, which abolitionist group did what, but the Garrisonians, named after William Lloyd Garrison, mostly centered in Boston. The Grafton abolitionists would have been Garrisonians for the most part. It got a little more pragmatic as you moved further west. Then you get, well, now I'm just going to bore you with all of that. But when he enters them, they're on the vanguard of human equality. Okay? They call for full equality of all men and all women. So this is a broad human rights agenda. They believe you should not participate in anything that is going to cause you to compromise your principles. I mean, they are unequivocal. Okay? This did not shock Douglass. Okay? Coming out of the black community, he was used to a world in which men and women worked side by side. Okay? In the fields and learning what they could, even purloining an education, in sustaining their churches, and the church was very important there, and in sustaining one another. Okay. So similar work by women in the anti-slavery movement wasn't unfamiliar to him. It was like kind of a smooth transition. What was unfamiliar to him was seeing women address audiences, particularly audiences containing both women and men, promiscuous audiences. I love that. And even more particularly, audiences of women and men that are facing mobs outside. And this is, I'm always telling students, you forget how hated abolitionists were at this time. And like I'm always telling my northern students, South wasn't the only place that kept racism. Okay. So, while you have these mobs outside throwing bricks, throwing stones, throwing what they pick up in the streets in the days in which horses were the main form of transportation. Okay? Yeah. And yelling all sorts of, stuff that, well, you know what they call Abby Kelly, and they using all sorts of epithets. So, this specific combination of Abby Kelly and Frederick Douglass, that is a white woman and a black man, speaking to mixed gender audiences, mixed race audiences, against slavery, this excited every animosity about the place of women and black men in public and in relationship to one another. Douglass and Kelly and other white women continued to challenge these prejudices by refusing to be intimidated and by continuing to treat one another as equals in friendship. And again, he faced a lot. I mean, they all faced a lot. Black women faced being called, prostitutes for being out in public and speaking. White women faced the same thing, but their whiteness armored them. When they came in public with him, then they were considered prostitutes. And he, being in public with them, he got beat up. So to do this was to risk a lot. And they continued to do it time after time after time because they knew exactly what they were doing. Now, furthermore, Douglass was barely a month into his abolitionist career when he met the woman in the middle on the top, and I got the picture as close as I could to the time in which he met her. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. He encountered her after a Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society meeting, and according to him, she went to great pains to set before me in very strong light the wrongs and injustices of women's ability to exercise political power. That was not something he had previously considered. I mean, equality is one thing. Political power, that's another thing. Now, she, incidentally, first of all, she was pregnant with one of those little boys there, visibly pregnant, which is, I get really good at counting to 9, or backwards from 9. She was which you do when you're doing women's history, and she was visibly pregnant at the time, and she's tearing into him about this, and she remembers it later in her life. She remembers it, and she said that he appeared like an African prince, conscious of his dignity and power, grand in his proportions, majestic in his wrath. I mean, come on. She kind of thought he was, well, I mean, look at him. Well, okay, it's not up here. But, I mean, we know what he looks like. Okay. Anyway, Stanton, maybe more than Susan B. Anthony, proved to be his gadfly on women's rights, and his embrace of political abolition, that is, using political means, not just moral means like the Garrisonians, paralleled her own insistence upon political solutions to women's inequality. So as a result, through the 1850s, when his own embrace of political abolition is increasing, when you have a lot more militants creeping into the abolition movement that is willingly not just to confront it, but to really get in the face, pull people out of jail who are being captured and sent back to slavery, he infrequently participated in many of the national women's rights conventions. And when he went to the explicitly male black conventions, which are a lesser known aspect of the abolitionist movement, they were called black male conventions. In fact, you can look at them, you can look up their proceedings online. There's a project that is publishing and transcribing a lot of their proceedings. But this began in the it had been earlier, but it revitalized in the 1850s, where you had black men and women, but it was mostly black men running the show, who were putting together a broad civil rights agenda in the North, which included ending slavery, but included education, and included jobs, and included a whole host of things that very much paralleled a lot of the things that women in the women's rights movement were asking for. But they were usually explicitly called black men's conventions. One of them was held in a church in Syracuse, New York, where I live, which is currently a Mexican restaurant. But anyway, they're held all over the country. And whenever he showed up at these, he and a number of his friends insisted upon women's participation as speakers, as representatives at these meetings, and insisted that women's rights be included as part of the agenda. And this was rather controversial. I mean, they even got into discussions of, we want to include women's rights. Well, we said people. Aren't women people? Yeah, but we kind of know you're kind of glossing over that. So let's specifically, explicitly say women. Mary Ann Shadd wants to speak. Well, that will turn this into a women's rights convention. Well, she's not asking for women. She wants to speak on education in the black press. But if she speaks, it turns it into women's rights. Just let her speak. So it kind of blurring all of these lines, and it's fascinating. Okay. But in any case, he's in there advocating for women having this equal role and advocating for women's rights. So in spite of, so he's calling for their inclusion, and in spite of the divisions between the white women's rights advocates and the black civil rights movement, which did increase over the late 1850s, but especially over the 14th and 15th Amendments for citizenship for everyone and black male suffrage, Douglass was actually much, much better at advocating for black women's rights and bringing women's rights into the black movement than the white women were. The white women were much more willing to sell off or compromise away black rights, which meant compromising away many of the women who were right there in the room supporting them. And white women's suffragists ultimately proved willing to ignore racial concerns of black women, while Douglass refused to ignore women's rights concern in the black movement. And I know there's a lot about him, oh, well, he sold them, he betrayed them over the 15th Amendment. He didn't write the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was created by a bunch of men who didn't want women to have the right to vote, and they weren't even sure if they wanted black men to have the right to vote. And this was what they got through at the most radical moment. So you either support it or you get nothing. So he didn't betray them. He had to make a political, pragmatic decision, as did everybody in that movement. Okay. Now, to give you an example, he did this all through his life. To give you an example, the woman up there in the corner, that's Ida B. Wells. Everyone's life is improved by having a little bit of Ida B. Wells in this. Oh, I'm sorry. My voice just keeps going down. Okay, Ida B. Wells up there in the corner. Ida B. Wells, who is younger than his daughters, more like a granddaughter age to him. Okay, at the end of his life, Ida B. Wells came to him to help her with her anti-lynching campaign. At a time when a younger generation of black male activists wanted him to attend their gatherings to give them historical capital, like, we're continuing his work, but scoffed at him as a relic of the past. Come, be present, grant to us legitimacy, but don't say it. Okay? She wanted him to participate as an activist. And she revived him from what was kind of a lull at that later point in his life. And he, in turn, threw the weight of his influence behind her to ensure that she found an audience and gained a hearing, or just even got her letters answered. When those same young black men, hearkening back to the days of the explicitly black men's convention, did not believe a woman should take up with a leadership position. In fact, there's some people who argue, some of her biographers argue, that if he was anointing anyone to be his successor, why not her? And so she certainly was very much like a younger version of him, just in a woman's body. So he supported her, and he also, just as a little side note, knew to put the pressure on the men, go to the black women's clubs. Because if you wanted anything to get done, especially in Washington, D.C., you went to the black women who had the black women's organizations. They got it done. But of course, I've drifted away. I kind of like made a big leap, drifted away. Let's link it back to the abolitionist movement. So returning to the 1840s and the train of Douglass's life. Douglass could have remained an employee of the American Anti-Slavery Society. Constantly away from home and his new family, by the time we get to the late 1840s, he's got 4 children. Four children. I'm not good with numbers. 4 children, 3 sons and 1 daughter. Rosetta, Lewis, Charles, Frederick Jr. Okay. Constantly away from home and his new family on lecture tours, earning less than white speakers, yes. Supplementing his income with his autobiography published in 1845, and following the party line message of the society, regardless of any new ideas or influences. And as we see him develop, he's got this voracious mind that just absorbs and incorporates new ideas. But then, in 1845 to 1847, he tours England, Scotland, and Ireland. And there, 3 things happened thanks to women. First, he learned the confidence of movement without intimidation, specifically in the company of white women. Specifically in the company of Isabel Jennings and her sisters, who were Irish abolitionists in Cork. He's kind of left in court with them just to drum up the abolitionist movement, and he's moving around, and suddenly it's a very, very different atmosphere. Nobody's giving him grief. In fact, they're kind of like, he's a celebrity, he's an American, come, do things with us. Okay? Second, a group of English women, now I don't have a picture of Isabel Jennings, but a group of English women, right down here, these three down here, actually two of these three down here, they began to campaign and raise funds that purchased his legal freedom. Okay? A controversial move, but they purchased his legal freedom and gave him the seed money to start up his own enterprise and thus have his own financial independence. And then third, he met Julia Griffiths. We'll get back to her because she's arguably one of the top 5 most important women in his life, not top 3. Anna being top 1. Okay. Well, maybe his mom because she gave birth to him, but okay. So anyway, so he returns to the United States with, his legal freedom in hand. So nobody can touch him, with his money to start up this paper. But then he meets with significant resistance from the American Anti-Slavery Society, who feared not only losing him as an effective lecturer, but also the competition that another anti-slavery newspaper would pose in a very risky and competitive field. Mariah Weston Chapman, who's the woman on the bottom in the center, herself kind of a very interesting figure, was key in thwarting his plans. She held a variety of administrative roles. She was also called Garrison's lieutenant. And we don't have a lot of correspondence between them because they were one of these face-to-face. She'd just go across town and talk to him, so she didn't have to write to him. But she was the society's secretary. And she believed that Douglass was a selfish person fighting for his own hand. Okay. Well, what it was she was patrician. So she was of a certain upper class, independently wealthy group of women who believed that when you got into philanthropy, into nonprofit activist work like this, you shouldn't be making a living from it. You did it as a volunteer work. But the problem being is that when women who had to work for a living got involved in it, she got very upset that their need to work for a living kept them away from doing the philanthropy and the activism. So Douglass is seeing that there's a way for these two things to work together, and she thought, well, that's just selfish, trying to profit off of this. And so it was two very different ways of looking at what's happening. Okay. So Douglass abandoned his plans to start his newspaper, and he embarked up on another lecturing tour that took him to Rochester, New York, okay, Western New York. And there he met Amy Post, who's down there in the corner with the fabulous shawl on. I knit and crochet, and I'm like, oh my God, the hours that went into that shawl. So, now, her biography, she's an incredibly important figure in activism at that time, and her biography has just been written by Nancy Hewitt. I highly recommend it. It is very readable, and she's really one of the most decent people you could ever meet. She's a Quaker, and she's following her inner light. She also became a spiritualist, and I could go on. But anyway, I recommend it's called Radical Friend. So Amy Post kind of held a comparable role to Maria Weston Chapman, but in the Western New York Anti-Slavery Society. She also had a very different style. And she had actually a year earlier asked Chapman if Chapman would let them employ for a time Douglass in Western New York to drum up anti-slavery activism. And she had written to Chapman saying, "No man has ever been among us who, in our opinion, is qualified for usefulness in the anti-slavery field." That is, nobody had really been very effective, except Douglass. And Douglass wrote to Post and said, I cherish your friendship because you knew me before I was important. You knew me when I was a nobody, and you liked me. Chapman had ignored Post's request back then, and now Douglass shows up and presents her with this possibility of bringing him to Rochester on a more permanent basis. And thus, they hatched the plan for Douglas to open the North Star in Rochester. And thus, history was made. He moves, he opens, by the end of the year, he's in Rochester, he starts a publication of the North Star. Ta-da! Except it didn't end happily ever after. The Western New York Anti-Slavery Society was going to help, it was kind of like the institutional support to help subvent and to do the fundraising and the subscriptions for the North Star, but they were divided. Their loyalties were divided between the American Anti-Slavery Society and him, and more importantly, their funds. A lot of this has to do with money. And by 1849, the paper was failing. I mean, failing so much that when he went to Albany, he's on his way to a meeting in Albany, and he stops at the Abigail Mott's house, and he's talking about turning his paper over to the American Anti-Slavery Society. And then he meets, then Julia Griffiths arrives, the English woman. Now, Julia Griffith had an energy that either impressed people, annoyed them, or wore them out. You probably met somebody like this, you know, they're a lot of work. And Amy Post's son described her as able to talk about anything at any time as long as anybody will hear. Which actually probably made her a very good conversational match for Douglas, because he could also, even Julia Griffith was saying, I can't keep writing this letter because Douglas is reading a book and he wants to talk about it now, so I have to go, and all of her letters are like exclamation point, underline, underline, underline. And so it's like, you can just, in a conversation with him, probably nobody could get a word in edgewise. So. Anyway, she came in and she brought experience in the publishing world, okay, transatlantic abolitionist and political connections, and the ability to mobilize a whole different set of women than Amy Post had, okay, because they had different abolitionist ideas. And she also courted abolitionist, the philanthropist Gerrit Smith, who was richer than God and willing to give away a lot of money, and his connections to the Liberty Party. And they were the political abolitionists, the ones who thought, you know what, change the laws. Slavery, yeah, it's morally wrong, but it's not just a moral problem, it's a political problem, and we just change the laws and end slavery. And so, Griffith ultimately ends up saving Douglas's newspaper, which allowed him the financial and intellectual independence to pursue new avenues of anti-slavery strategies, to bring in apprentices, both white and black young men, to learn the printing trade, including his own sons, which gave them a way to earn a living, and understand, earn a living that was not like day labor, not like physical labor, but they could actually learn a trade. Enabled him to employ a variety of voices. There's a young woman in England now who's analyzing all of the kinds of people who wrote for the North Star and Frederick Douglass's paper. So he brought in a variety of voices, many black writers, men and women, who had this platform to write for and to speak to. And he could support his family as an upstanding middle-class entrepreneur. She enabled him to be that Emersonian, self-reliant man. Okay, that ideal. Do not underestimate the significance of that sort of independence and status to a man who had once been a slave. Okay. And this is in a span of 15 years since he was a slave. As a result, by the end of the decade, he was one of the leading black voices in the nation, engaged in the work that we know him for today, poised to meet presidents like Lincoln, Johnson, everyone after that, until his death, really, to influence the direction of the war, the Civil War, the Constitution, and the nation. Now, thus far, I have omitted two of the most important women in his life, his wives. Anna Murray and Helen Pitts. They did not overlap. Now, both of these women played not only the conventional role of the woman who kept the domestic front together, as their Anna and Frederick's daughter Rosetta put it, Anna kept the house together, and she freed Frederick from all the worries and the concerns of running the household so he could go about his work. But she did so much more than that. Okay. They both also challenged 19th century ideologies about race and what the interactions of two black people could do and a black man and a white woman could do. Okay. Few biographers have exhibited much curiosity about or even empathy for either woman. Although I found audiences, especially women, are deeply, deeply interested in both, and Anna is very, very important to black women. The two women generally appear in biographies as symbolic contrasts. Okay. The choice of his youth. Okay. A dark-skinned black woman, older than her husband by 3 to 6 years, born free but working class, who never learned to read. The second, the choice of his old age. A white woman, young enough to be her husband's daughter, although incidentally she was in her 40s when they married, so it wasn't like he's marrying some young chippy. And also, to give you some kind of comparison, she's of the age his grandmother was when she became a grandmother. Okay, so age was older then than it is now. College educated, Mount Holyoke. And indeed, when biographers are not using Anna to bludgeon her husband, they betray a certain prejudice against her as if she were not good enough for him, their grand Frederick. Or she alone were the source of friction in this very long marriage of two very strong-willed individuals. Likewise, and those who believe that he, keep insisting that he cheated on her, they seem to blame her. Likewise, some audiences express a lot of hostility towards Helen. Not her per se, because really there wasn't a lot known about her until, just bragging on myself. But she was more just like a symbol, okay? And the hostility echoes criticism of the marriage at the time, seeing her as appropriating the white woman appropriating a good black man, and him marrying her, thus being a repudiation of African Americans. Okay. But all of these assessments seem very grossly unfair to Anna, to Helen, to Frederick, and also misunderstand the importance and complexities of the history of marriage. It wasn't always the way we think of it today. And the importance and inner workings of these marriages in particular. Because as we all know, every marriage is its own thing at its own time. Okay. And, people like to say, they want to characterize this marriage, the first one. Is it was a happy marriage? Or was it a contentious marriage? And I'm not even going to try to go there. Okay. Because 44 years. I think of my grandparents' marriage, which was I want to say 64 years. I think of my parents' marriage, which would have been, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, 54 years, the week after my father's funeral. Okay. I think of my brother's marriage, which, he's been with his wife about 20 years, and I look at these marriages, and it's just you know what? How do you characterize a life of two people together, having children? How do you characterize it as any one thing? Okay, it itself is a biography. It itself is a thing. Okay? And you have to think about what it was when these two young people got together, okay, and what they wanted and what they expected. And the Douglases, Anna and Frederick, when they got together, he 20 years old, 19, 20 years old. She 26, maybe a little younger, 23 to 26, a little louder. Sing out, Louise. I'm sorry, do you want me to be louder? When they got together, here they are, you know, what did they want? When they looked forward, they probably wanted a harmonious marriage, because when you read about marriage in the early 19th century, harmonious is what they asked for. Not romantic love, but a harmonious marriage. Like, can we live together? Okay? They probably wanted a stable marriage, a faithful marriage, a partnership in raising their children. So this, you know, this would have been something they wanted to do away from a slave society, where their children could be educated, where he could pursue his ambition to be a community leader. She would be mistress of her own house, not somebody else's. Raise her own children, not someone else's. Where their family would never, ever face being torn apart. And so, this, you know, the vision of these two young people, they could never, ever have guessed that within 3 years of their wedding, that so many things would change. Their marriage would endure another 41 years after Frederick entered the anti-slavery world. Some of the most tumultuous years of the 19th century, with Frederick very near its epicenter. This all in addition to the birth of 5 children, one, Annie, who dies at the age of 10. The birth of 20 grandchildren, the majority of which die young. The fire that destroyed their home in Rochester. A threat, constant threats, of Douglas's return to slavery until he got that legal freedom. Constant threats to Frederick's life. Attacks on their family in the press, even from people who were supposed to be their allies. The general intrusive curiosity about their home life. Living in constant violation of the federal fugitive slave law, first with Frederick being a fugitive himself, but then also by bringing fugitives into their house, people running away, trying to get away from slavery. I mean, some of these things, families today don't even survive. Okay. This was not the sort of stress a young couple could predict. Okay. Yet the constancy in their life remained their steadfast commitment to this project of their family. Okay. Holding it together, protecting it from the outside world, okay. And also seeing Frederick's work as part of that project for the greater good of their people. Okay. So whatever conflict existed within, it was within, and it was privacy, and that was something they also demanded. Okay. And this, broadly speaking, was a joint political act in the face of racist ideas that African Americans were incapable of doing this, incapable of forming enduring family ties, or entitled to private lives. Now, Anna died in 1882 after debilitating strokes. And Douglas fell into a very deep mourning, lamenting that mother was the post in the center of my house and held us together. And another very touching portrait is from his granddaughter, who was a small child at the time, and she remembered her and her sisters going to the house on the morning of their grandmother's funeral and finding their grandfather sitting and crying, weeping. And all he could say was, "You have no grandmother. Your grandmother is gone now." And they started crying too. So this portrait, I mean, there's very few images of Douglas crying, and right there, he's weeping at the loss of his wife, of this woman who had been with him for over half of his life. Now, 2 years later, in 1884, Douglas had begun to learn to accept her loss. And there's really no word for that, you know, this piece of your life is gone. Okay. Move on is not, people like to say, she moved on. No. Okay. But he did remarry, and he remarried Helen. And there's a defining feature of Helen other than being a woman. As he put it, we set the world ablaze with indignation. Okay. The bride is Helen Pitts, a clerk in his Recorder of Deeds office. Sometimes they like to say secretary. I don't like calling her a secretary because A, she wasn't a secretary, and B, that invokes images of madmen, you know, the boss leaving his wife for a secretary. That wasn't it. It was, in those days, he was a Recorder of Deeds. That's a lot of legal documents that have to be filed in a lot of different places, and women with lovely penmanship were the copy machines of the day. And that's what she was. She first met Frederick when she was 15, and he had spoken in her small western New York town of Honeoye while her family were committed abolitionists. She threw herself into the work with the most conviction. During the Civil War, and this was actually key in understanding, because nobody ever asked, you know, they always figured, well, of course she'd marry him. Well, who wouldn't, you know? Well, okay, maybe straight men, but who would, and lesbians, but why wouldn't she marry him? Of course she'd marry him. But, you know, and why wouldn't he marry her? She's a white woman, which is really kind of racist and incurious. Okay, what was the attraction? Okay, and she ran a risk marrying him, but this is the key that kind of made everything click. During the Civil War, she went down. She was one of the first teachers for the American Missionary Association, which was kind of one of the private precursors to the Freedmen's Bureau, and she taught freeds people in Norfolk, Virginia, which was kind of the epicenter of where emancipation began. That's where Benjamin Butler first issued his order that all of these people running from the plantation that their masters had left should be designated contraband and thus free, before the Emancipation Proclamation declared them as such. So she's there teaching 300 students in the morning, 300 in the afternoon, 6 days a week, and then 500 on Sundays. And so that's I was like, okay, I get it. She put herself on the line, and it like many of those people who were in the classes, like many of the teachers who followed her, it ruined her health. Okay. So she was there for 2 years, and after recovery, she tried to return to teaching. Okay, but she eventually wound up in Washington, D.C. doing clerical work. Her uncle was Douglas's neighbor, so it was a patronage job. And when they got together, she and Frederick, they're both older. He's in his 60s, she's in her 40s. And she seemed to have passed her childbearing years. She didn't seem to have had any desire to have children. And they kind of, like, you know, what Tina Turner used to say, what's love got to do with it? Companionship. Okay? I think they loved each other too. I think Anna and Frederick loved each other. Okay? But they enjoyed the companionship. And symbolically, the marriage served to puncture American hypocrisy about race. Because Frederick had never hidden the possibility, in fact, the probability, that a white man, his master, was his father. Therefore, when people objected to him marrying a white woman, that he was marrying outside of his race, he said, well, wouldn't I have married outside of my race if I married a black woman? What is race? And so, as Ida B. Wells, who became their friend, pointed out, the coupling of black men and white women was not uncommon. It was just clandestine or illegal or portrayed as rape. And then, as they both pointed out, the other way, that is, white men with black women, was very much embedded in American history. Thomas Jefferson, for instance. In fact, their friend William Wells Brown wrote a novel about that. The second Douglas marriage, however, was public, registered in the courts, and based on mutual affection. And indeed, in both of these marriages, Douglas told the world that black men and women were not beasts, as popular stereotypes would have you think, but feeling people capable of love. And love was an essential human need. Race was a fiction to justify abuse. Now, Helen's relative youth meant that she would outlive him, which meant that she was going to be the one to ensure his legacy. Thus, he left her all of his books, all of his papers, and his house, Cedar Hill, which was actually more of a small farm. Now, at the time of his death in 1895, a battle for the memory of the Civil War and abolition was raging through monuments. This is when all of those Confederate monuments were starting to go up. Museums and archive collections. Most of the papers we have about the abolitionist movement are coming from those white Garrisonians, and commemorative celebrations. Okay. At the same time, the concept of a house museum itself was unusual, and a house museum commemorating a black man's life entirely unheard of. Mount Vernon was the only real example of a house museum. And Helen, who had visited with Douglas Mount Vernon several times, it's really literally just up the river from their house in Anacostia, hatched this idea to turn their home, Cedar Hill, into an abolitionist Mount Vernon. Okay. So what she wants to do is turn their home into an abolitionist shrine to Douglas's life. Okay. Whereas Mount Vernon told the story of the founding of American freedom through the life of George Washington, Cedar Hill would tell the somewhat different story of the fulfillment of American freedom through the life of Frederick Douglass. Okay. And that's pretty much the story they tell today, okay, under the National Park Service. She spent the last years of her life courting the leading black club women, remember I told you they're the ones who get things done, of Washington, D.C., including Ida B. Wells, her friend, who formed the Frederick Douglass Memorial and Historical Association. And then after she died, she willed the home and its property to the association. And at that time it was headed by Mary Talbert. In the 1960s, because kind of keeping the house together was a very expensive proposition, they turned the house over to the National Park Service. And then the papers, at one time you could go research his papers like in the house. Because of the way that the library, I wonder how many papers walked off. But in the 1970s, the papers were then turned over to the Library of Congress, where they then microfilmed them, and now you have to beg to see the real ones. But in the late 1990s and early 2000s, they digitized them, and you can now, which is fabulous. You can get, thank God, you can now go and, because I hate microfilm, you can now go and look at them online on the Library of Congress website. They're making American Memory website. Just put in Library of Congress, Frederick Douglass papers. And so, because of Helen's vision, we can now research this collection, visit Douglas's home. It's a thing in the landscape that counteracts everything else, everything that was going on at the time. And incidentally, just to bring the whole women thing forward, the director of the Frederick Douglass National Historical Site, a woman, Julie Cudriff.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so, of course, these, like I said, okay, to bring it all home, okay, these women were not the only influences on Frederick Douglass. I mean, you could write a whole book about the black men he worked with. I mean, early in his career, not just Abby Kelly, Charles Lennox Reman was, always got in trouble with him. I mean, they whenever they got together, it was like you knew something was going to happen. There's many, anyway. They were not the only women in his life. Still, in my book, what I wanted to do was emphasize this feminine influence, because while this method of viewing a biographical subject through the women who surround him has become popular more than most other subjects who have received this treatment, Douglass was a man for whom women played a defining role. Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, he would have written the Declaration of Independence and become president. Okay. Women were not critical players in that. Mozart would have composed his great symphonies. Dickens would have written his novels. I'm not saying that women weren't important in their lives, but they were not critical to all of this. But Douglass, his escape, his image as an upstanding middle-class black man, his legal freedom, his intellectual freedom, his ability to become intellectually and financially independent, his legacy, his essential message of equality, all of this was predicated upon the work of women and his work with women. They were not the cliche of the woman behind the man who freed him of his daily care so he could do his work. They were the women who made the man. And for all of his self-made man rhetoric, he would be the first to acknowledge it. Because as he said, I belong to the women. So thank you for sitting here.